Hi everybody. I hope you are doing well tonight. Before we begin tonight's story, if you enjoy history told through stories like this, please consider subscribing. And I would love to hear from you as well. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you relaxing after work, getting ready for bed, driving home, or perhaps listening from somewhere else entirely? Let me know down in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. Tonight, we are exploring the Black Death, one of the deadliest disease outbreaks in human history. It may have killed as many as 50 million people and changed Europe forever. But numbers can sometimes feel distant. The people who lived through the plague were not numbers. Imagine sharing dinner with your family after a long day. The conversation feels ordinary. Tomorrow feels certain. A year later, one of those chairs is empty. Then another. A familiar neighbor no longer appears each morning. A workshop loses skilled workers. A village grows quieter than before. For many survivors, that was the true impact of the Black Death. Not a single terrible moment, but a slow realization that the world around them was changing. Families lost loved ones. Communities lost friends. And everyday life became harder. Yet diseases do not cross continents alone. They need roads, ships, and people. That is where our story begins. Before the plague arrived, Europe was thriving. Trade expanded. Cities grew larger. People traveled farther than ever before. The future seemed bright. But the same connections that created prosperity would eventually help carry disaster. And while Europe celebrated its success, the first signs of trouble were already beginning to appear far beyond the horizon. Along the great trade routes of Asia, merchants began hearing unusual stories. At first, they sounded like ordinary rumors. Travelers always carried stories with them. Some spoke of wars. Others spoke of droughts, bandits, or political unrest. Most were forgotten within days. Yet these stories refused to disappear. A merchant might hear them in one market, then hear them again hundreds of miles away. The details changed, but the pattern remained. People were becoming sick unexpectedly. Entire households were falling ill. Some towns were growing quieter than before. Nobody seemed to understand why. That uncertainty made the stories unsettling. People could see the consequences, but they could not see the cause. And a danger without an explanation often feels far more frightening. Still, life continued. Merchants loaded their wagons. Ships crossed busy seas. Markets welcomed new arrivals every day. Trade had brought prosperity for generations. There seemed no reason to stop. In fact, the rumors felt too distant to matter. Most Europeans would never visit the places being discussed. Those cities existed only in stories. Far beyond the horizon. Far beyond their daily concerns. Yet distance can be deceptive. The same trade routes carrying silk and spices were also carrying information. Each traveler passed the stories to someone new. Each journey carried the rumors a little farther west. And with every mile those stories traveled, something else was moving as well. Something unseen. Something far more dangerous than the rumors themselves. Long before the plague reached Europe, the warnings arrived first. Most people simply did not recognize them. And before long, one important trading city would discover that those warnings had been true all along. That city was Kaffa. Located on the Black Sea, Kaffa was a thriving center of trade. Merchants arrived from distant lands. Ships filled its harbor. Goods flowed through its markets. For years, prosperity had made the city wealthy. Its success depended on connections. Connections to trade routes. Connections to travelers. Connections to the wider world. The very things that made Kaffa successful also made it vulnerable. Around the middle of the 14th century, troubling reports began arriving from nearby regions. People were becoming sick. Some died within days. Others vanished from daily life almost overnight. At first, many dismissed the stories. Cities often faced hardship. Disease was not unusual in the medieval world. Most outbreaks remained local. Most eventually faded away. Life inside Kaffa continued much as before. Merchants negotiated prices. Dockworkers unloaded cargo. Sailors prepared for their next voyage. The harbor remained busy. Yet the reports continued. Week after week, they moved closer. Places that once felt distant no longer seemed so far away. People began paying attention. Not because they understood the danger, but because the same stories kept returning. The same fear. The same unexplained illness. The same growing silence left behind. For the first time, uncertainty began spreading through the city. Not panic. Not yet. Just a quiet feeling that something was wrong. Still, trade continued. The gates remained open. The ships kept arriving. Kaffa depended on them. Without trade, the city could not prosper. That decision would have consequences. Because while the people of Kaffa worried about rumors, the real threat was already much closer than anyone realized. And before long, the city would find itself standing directly in the path of history. Yet most people living there could not see it. They saw ships arriving in the harbor. They saw merchants filling the markets. They saw another ordinary day. That was the strange thing about the plague. For a long time, it remained invisible. People saw the consequences before they understood the cause. A neighbor became sick. A family stopped appearing in public. A familiar face suddenly vanished from daily life. At first, these events seemed isolated. Then they became harder to ignore. Reports arrived from nearby settlements. More people were falling ill. More communities were struggling. The stories that once sounded distant now felt alarmingly close. Conversations began to change. Merchants spoke less about profits. Travelers asked more questions. People searched for explanations. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed contaminated food. Many simply hoped the problem would pass. Hope was easier than understanding. After all, nobody knew what a bacterium was. Nobody understood how disease truly spread. The medieval world had few answers. And when people cannot explain a danger, they often fill the gaps with guesses. Still, life continued. The harbor remained busy. The markets remained crowded. Trade remained essential. Every arriving ship brought opportunity. But it also brought uncertainty. That was the consequence of living in a connected world. The same network that created wealth made isolation impossible. Kaffa could not simply close itself off. Its success depended on staying connected. Yet every new connection carried risk. And with each passing week, the reports became more alarming. More sickness. More deaths. More fear. Something was moving across the trade routes. Something that ignored borders. something that did not care about wealth, status, or distance. The people of Kaffa still believed they had time. Many thought the danger would pass them by. After all, cities had survived hardships before. Wars came and went. Trade slowed, then recovered. Disease appeared, then faded. There was little reason to believe this time would be different. Yet the reports continued to worsen. Travelers arrived with troubling news. Entire communities were struggling. Some roads had become noticeably quieter. In certain places, merchants found fewer customers than before. The consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as distant rumors was now affecting trade itself. And trade was the lifeblood of cities like Kaffa. Less trade meant less income. Less income meant greater uncertainty. People began paying closer attention. Not because they understood the threat, but because they could see its effects. That is often how great disasters begin. The consequences appear first. The cause remains hidden. A merchant notices fewer travelers. A dock worker notices fewer ships. A shopkeeper notices fewer customers. Each change seems small on its own. Together, they tell a larger story. Yet most people still focused on daily life. Families needed food. Businesses needed income. The city needed trade. Life had to continue. And so the gates remained open. The harbor remained active. New ships continued arriving from distant regions. That decision seemed reasonable at the time. In fact, it probably felt necessary. But every arriving vessel created another connection. Another pathway. Another opportunity for danger to move farther west. The same network that had helped cities prosper was now carrying something far more destructive. And before long, the people of Kaffa would no longer be hearing about the plague from travelers. They would be witnessing its consequences with their own eyes. Not through rumors. Not through travelers' stories. But in their own streets. By now, fear was spreading faster than certainty. Everyone seemed to have heard something. Yet nobody knew exactly what was happening. People could prepare for a known danger. They could not prepare for an unknown one. Then the first cases began appearing closer to the city. A sailor became seriously ill. A traveler failed to recover. A family suddenly disappeared from public life. At first, most people assumed these were isolated tragedies. People became sick all the time in the medieval world. But this felt different. The stories kept matching. The same rapid decline. The same unexpected deaths. The same pattern appearing again and again. Slowly, concern turned into fear. Merchants discussed the situation in crowded markets. Sailors exchanged rumors along the docks. Families wondered whether the stories were finally reaching them. Yet daily life continued. It had to. Food still needed to be sold. Ships still needed to be unloaded. That was the cruel reality. Even when danger feels close, life rarely stops. And so the city remained connected to the outside world. Every arriving ship brought goods. It brought news. And potentially something else. Something unseen. Something traveling quietly through the same networks that made Kaffa prosperous. By now, some people were beginning to understand that the plague was not a distant problem. It was becoming their problem. But understanding a danger and stopping it are very different things. The city was beginning to realize the threat was real. Unfortunately, the plague was already moving faster than their response. And soon, events outside Kaffa's walls would make the situation far worse than anyone imagined. The city was not only facing disease, it was also caught in a military conflict. For years, control of the region had been contested. Armies moved across the landscape. Trade routes became battlegrounds. And now, those two crises were beginning to collide. As the siege continued, reports of sickness appeared among the attacking forces. At first, few people inside Kaffa paid much attention. Why would they? Disease in an enemy camp could seem like good news. A weakened enemy was less dangerous. At least, that was the hope. But disease does not recognize sides. It does not care who wins battles. It does not care who controls cities. Soon, more soldiers became ill. More deaths followed. What had seemed like an advantage was becoming something far more alarming. The scale of the outbreak was difficult to ignore. People on both sides could see the consequences. Fewer soldiers. More graves. More uncertainty. Yet nobody fully understood what they were facing. The medieval world had many explanations for disease. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed divine punishment. Many simply accepted sickness as part of life. Few imagined that an outbreak in one camp could become a disaster for an entire continent. That was the hidden danger. The plague was no longer moving quietly through distant trade routes. It had arrived at one of the most important crossroads connecting East and West. And crossroads exist for one reason. They connect people. They connect goods. They connect worlds. For generations, that connection had created wealth. Now it was creating opportunity for something else. Something deadly. The people inside Kaffa still hoped the crisis would remain outside their walls. History would prove otherwise. Because the boundary between the city and the plague was about to disappear. For months, the people of Kaffa had watched events unfold from a distance. The danger felt close. But it still felt separate. There was the city. And there was the world outside its walls. That distinction gave people comfort. It allowed them to believe they were protected. Yet walls can stop armies. They cannot always stop disease. As sickness spread through the besieging forces, desperation began to grow. More soldiers became ill. More soldiers died. The outbreak was no longer a minor problem. It was becoming a crisis. And desperate people often make desperate decisions. According to later accounts, the attacking army began using the bodies of plague victims in an attempt to spread fear and disease inside the city. Whether every detail is true remains debated. But one fact is not. The plague was now at Kaffa's doorstep. No one could pretend otherwise. Fear spread through the city. Families worried about loved ones. Merchants worried about their livelihoods. City leaders searched for solutions. Yet there were few good options. Kaffa depended on trade. Trade depended on movement. And movement created risk. Closing the city could damage its economy. Keeping it open could invite disaster. Neither choice felt safe. That was the consequence of living in a connected world. The same connections that created prosperity now made isolation almost impossible. Soon, some residents made a decision. If danger was approaching, perhaps they could escape it. Ships were prepared. Supplies were gathered. And people began looking toward the sea. What they did not realize was that they might already be carrying the very thing they hoped to leave behind. And when those ships finally departed Kaffa, the story of the Black Death would enter a new chapter. One that would change Europe forever. To the people preparing to depart, the decision made perfect sense. The city no longer felt safe. The siege continued. Fear was growing. The sea offered an escape. For generations, ships had connected distant parts of the world. They carried silk, spices, gold, and opportunity. Now they carried something else. Something nobody could see. As vessels left Kaffa, they crossed the Black Sea and entered busy trade networks linking Europe to Asia. Life on board was difficult. Space was limited. Food was carefully rationed. Weeks could pass before reaching a destination. Under those conditions, sickness could spread quickly. And by the time some ships approached European ports, something felt terribly wrong. Sailors were becoming ill. Crew members were disappearing from daily duties. Deaths were becoming more common. The people arriving at port needed help. At least, that was how they appeared. No one looking from shore could know they were witnessing the beginning of a historic disaster. After all, Europe had welcomed trading ships for centuries. Their arrival usually meant business, news, opportunity, not catastrophe. Yet the consequences of those voyages were already unfolding. The plague had found exactly what it needed: movement, connections, and a network stretching across continents. The same trade routes that made Europe prosperous were now carrying disease toward its busiest ports. A threat that once seemed distant was becoming local. A problem that belonged to someone else was becoming everyone's problem. Soon, one Sicilian port would receive several of these ships. The people waiting there expected merchants and cargo. Instead, they were about to receive something far more dangerous. And from that moment forward, the Black Death would no longer be approaching Europe. It would be inside it. It had arrived. In October of 1347, several ships reached the Sicilian port of Messina. From a distance, they looked like any other trading vessels. Merchants had arrived there for generations. The harbor depended on them. The city prospered because of them. Nothing about the ships seemed unusual at first. But as people drew closer, they began noticing something was wrong. Many sailors never came ashore. Others appeared seriously ill. Some could barely stand. Others were already dead. The scene shocked those waiting at the docks. Nobody expected to find ships filled with sickness. Nobody expected to find death. Word spread quickly through the city. The arriving vessels brought more than cargo. They brought fear. City leaders faced a difficult decision. The danger seemed obvious. Yet nobody fully understood it. They could see the consequences. They could not see the cause. Still, they knew something was terribly wrong. The ships were ordered to leave. On the surface, it seemed like the right choice. If the danger arrived by sea, send it away. Protect the city. Protect its people. But by then, it was already too late. The plague had reached Messina. Some sailors had already come ashore. Some residents had already been exposed. The city could remove the ships. It could not remove what had already arrived. That was one of the cruel realities of the Black Death. People often recognized the danger only after it was among them. Within weeks, sickness began spreading through the city. Families watched loved ones fall ill. Neighbors disappeared from daily life. Fear replaced confidence. And as people fled Messina seeking safety, they unknowingly carried the plague with them. The consequences of that decision would be enormous. Because every traveler became a new connection. Every journey became a new pathway. And from Sicily, the Black Death would begin spreading across Europe. And it was moving faster than anyone imagined. People fleeing Messina believed they were escaping danger. In reality, many were carrying it with them. That was the tragedy. The very act of seeking safety often helped the plague travel farther. A merchant left for another city. A sailor boarded a different ship. A family packed their belongings and headed inland. Each journey created a new pathway. Soon, reports began appearing in other ports. Then in other towns. Then in other regions. At first, many communities struggled to believe what they were hearing. The stories sounded too frightening. Too distant. Yet the reports kept arriving. The same illness. The same fear. The same growing number of deaths. Wherever the plague appeared, daily life began to change. Markets grew quieter. Travel became less common. People avoided places that once felt familiar. Some families stopped visiting neighbors. Others stayed indoors whenever possible. Nobody knew exactly how the disease spread. That uncertainty made everything worse. When people do not understand a threat, fear fills the gap. Rumors spread almost as quickly as the plague itself. Some blamed foreigners. Some blamed poisoned wells. Others believed the outbreak was a punishment from God. People were desperate for answers. But answers were difficult to find. One town remained healthy. Another nearby town was suddenly overwhelmed. No solution seemed reliable. With each passing month, the disease continued advancing across the continent. The connections that once made Europe prosperous were now accelerating disaster. Roads carried merchants. Ships carried sailors. And both carried the plague. What began as a crisis in a distant port was becoming a continental emergency. Before long, some of Europe's largest cities would face the same terrifying question. How do you stop a threat that is already inside your gates? The truth was that most cities had no answer. They had never faced anything like the Black Death. People understood war. They understood famine. But this was different. The plague seemed to appear without warning. Then it spread with frightening speed. In many places, the first signs were easy to dismiss. A few people became sick. A few families suffered losses. At first, life continued much as before. Markets remained open. Church bells continued to ring. Merchants continued doing business. Then the number of sick people began to grow. And with that growth came fear. Doctors tried treatments based on the knowledge of their time. Religious leaders encouraged prayer. City officials searched for solutions. Yet nothing seemed to stop the disease. That became one of the most frightening consequences of the plague. People could see it spreading. But they could not control it. Every new death created more anxiety. Every new rumor created more uncertainty. Soon, daily life began changing across Europe. People avoided crowds. Some refused to travel. Others isolated themselves whenever possible. Trust began to weaken. Not because people wanted to abandon one another, but because nobody knew where the danger might appear next. The plague had transformed an invisible threat into a constant presence. And as the disease moved from city to city, Europe was beginning to realize that this was not a temporary crisis. It was something much larger. Something that would reshape the continent for generations to come. And the worst years of the Black Death were only just beginning. By now, the plague was no longer a distant threat. It was part of daily life. People woke each morning wondering who might fall sick next. Families worried about loved ones leaving home. Merchants worried about empty markets. City leaders worried about maintaining order. Fear had become a constant companion. And fear carried consequences of its own. Some people fled cities, hoping to escape the disease. Others refused to leave their homes. Many avoided neighbors they had known for years. Communities that once depended on trust began to feel different. Not because people stopped caring, but because they were frightened. And frightened people often make difficult choices. The plague was changing behavior as much as it was changing populations. Across Europe, labor became harder to find. Fields went unworked. Workshops lost skilled craftsmen. Businesses struggled to operate normally. The consequences spread far beyond health. Economic life began to slow. Daily routines became harder to maintain. Entire communities felt the strain. That was what made the Black Death so devastating. It affected nearly every part of life. Not just families. Not just cities. But the systems that held society together. Yet amid the fear, life continued. Children still grew up. Farmers still planted crops. Merchants still searched for opportunities. People adapted because they had no other choice. Human beings have always done that. Even during history's darkest moments. And as Europe struggled to adjust, another consequence was quietly taking shape. The plague was reducing the population on a scale few had ever imagined. At first, that seemed only tragic. Soon, it would begin changing the balance between workers and employers. A transformation that would reshape European society long after the disease itself had faded. For generations, landowners had depended on a large workforce. There were always people willing to work. There were always more hands available. The Black Death changed that balance. Across Europe, millions had died. Fields still needed planting. Roads still needed maintenance. Businesses still needed workers. But there were far fewer people available to do the work. For the first time in many places, labor became valuable in a new way. Workers could ask for better wages. Some could choose where they worked. Others left difficult conditions in search of better opportunities. To many ordinary people, these changes offered hope. A farm worker might earn more than before. A craftsman might find greater demand for his skills. A family that had struggled for years could suddenly see new possibilities. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Many landowners feared losing control. Governments worried about rising wages. Some leaders attempted to limit what workers could earn. They hoped life would return to the way it had been before. But history rarely moves backwards so easily. The plague had changed too much. The old system depended on people who were no longer there. That reality could not be ignored. One by one, communities adapted. Employers competed for workers. Survivors discovered they possessed something increasingly valuable. Their labor. Their skills. Their experience. It was an unexpected consequence of a terrible tragedy. The Black Death brought immense suffering. Yet it also altered the relationship between wealth and work. And as Europe slowly emerged from the worst years of the plague, new opportunities began appearing in places where few had existed before. The disease had taken millions of lives, but it had also begun reshaping the future. A future that would look very different from the world that existed before the plague arrived. For many survivors, the changes did not happen overnight. The Black Death did not end with a single event. Its effects lingered for decades. Entire communities had to rebuild. Families adjusted to lives they had never expected. Children grew up in a Europe transformed by loss. Yet they also grew up in a Europe filled with new possibilities. Land became easier to obtain in some regions. Wages remained higher than before. Many workers discovered they had greater freedom to choose their future. The balance of power was slowly shifting. That shift created tensions. Some leaders wanted to preserve older traditions. Others accepted that society was changing. The debate would continue for generations. But the direction of history had already changed. That was one of the most remarkable consequences of the Black Death. A disease that brought so much suffering also accelerated social change. The plague did not create every transformation by itself. Yet it pushed existing trends forward. It forced societies to adapt. And it forced people to imagine a different future. Not everyone benefited. Many never recovered from their losses. Many carried grief for the rest of their lives. That reality should never be forgotten. Behind every statistic stood a real person. A parent. A child. A friend. A neighbor. The Black Death was a story of millions. But it was also a story of individuals. People whose lives were interrupted by forces they could neither see nor understand. Perhaps that is why the story still feels relevant today. Because beneath the history, beneath the numbers, it remains a human story. A story about resilience. A story about adaptation. And a story about how societies respond when the world changes around them. By the late 14th century, Europe was no longer the same continent it had once been. The plague had left scars, but it had also left a new world in its wake. When the worst years finally passed, Europe began the slow process of recovery. The church bells still rang. Markets reopened. Farmers returned to their fields. Ships continued crossing familiar seas. Life moved forward because it had to. Yet nothing was quite the same. Many survivors spent the rest of their lives remembering those who were gone. Every village had stories. Every city carried memories. Every family had experienced loss in some form. The Black Death became more than a disease. It became a dividing line. There was life before the plague, and life after it. Future generations would inherit a different Europe. A Europe with fewer people, different opportunities, and new social realities. Many of those changes would help shape the centuries that followed. That is why historians still study the Black Death today. Not only because of the lives it claimed, but because of the world it created afterward. Its impact reached far beyond the 14th century. It influenced economies. It influenced politics. It influenced the lives of people who had never experienced the plague themselves. The consequences continued long after the disease faded. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this story. History is rarely shaped by a single moment. It is shaped by consequences. One event leads to another. One decision creates new possibilities. One crisis changes the future in ways nobody expects. The Black Death was one of those events. A tragedy that brought immense suffering. A disaster that transformed a continent. And a reminder that even the darkest chapters of history can reshape the world for generations. What began as distant rumors along the trade routes of the East eventually changed Europe forever. And that is how the Black Death became one of the most consequential events in human history. Yet for the people who lived through it, the future remained uncertain. They did not know their experiences would be studied centuries later. They only knew that life had changed. A farmer looked across fields worked by fewer hands. A merchant traveled roads that felt different than before. A craftsman discovered his skills were suddenly more valuable. Each person experienced the consequences differently. Yet together, they were helping create a new Europe. That transformation did not happen because people planned it. It happened because societies adapted. When old systems stopped working, new ones emerged. When labor became scarce, its value increased. When communities faced loss, they found ways to rebuild. Human beings have always done that. They endure. They adapt. They move forward. Perhaps that is why the story of the Black Death remains so compelling. It is not only a story about disease. It is a story about resilience. About how ordinary people respond when their world changes. And about how history often moves in unexpected directions. The plague brought tragedy on a scale few could comprehend. Millions lost their lives. Millions more lost friends, neighbors, and family members. Yet the survivors continued building lives for themselves. They planted crops. They reopened businesses. They raised children. And little by little, they created the foundations of the world that followed. The Black Death changed Europe forever. But it did not end Europe. Even after immense hardship, people continued. They adapted to new realities. They rebuilt what was lost. And eventually, they created something new. That process was already beginning before the 14th century came to an end. Its consequences would shape Europe for hundreds of years to come. By the end of the 14th century, the plague had become part of Europe's collective memory. People told stories about it. Families passed down memories of those difficult years. Communities remembered the losses they had endured. Even those born after the worst outbreaks grew up hearing about them. The Black Death was no longer just an event. It had become a lesson. A reminder that prosperity alone could not guarantee safety. A reminder that distant events could have local consequences. And a reminder that human societies are often more connected than they realize. That lesson began with trade. The same routes that carried wealth also carried disease. The same connections that created opportunity also created vulnerability. Throughout this story, that pattern appeared again and again. One decision led to another. One connection created another pathway. And eventually, those pathways allowed the plague to spread across a continent. Yet they also allowed ideas to spread. Knowledge to spread. Recovery to spread. History rarely delivers only one consequence. The Black Death brought suffering on an unimaginable scale. But it also transformed Europe in ways that still interest historians today. That complexity is part of what makes the story so fascinating. It is not simply a story about death. It is a story about change. About adaptation. About the unexpected consequences of a connected world. And in many ways, it remains surprisingly modern. Because even today, people continue asking the same questions. How should societies respond to crisis? How do communities recover after loss? And what happens when events far away suddenly become impossible to ignore? The people of the 14th century never found perfect answers. But their experiences left lessons that continue to echo through history. And that is one reason the story of the Black Death is still remembered today. Not simply because millions died. History contains many tragedies. What makes the Black Death remarkable is how completely it changed the world left behind. For the people living through those years, however, none of that was visible. A farmer still worried about his next harvest. A merchant still planned his next journey. A family still gathered around the dinner table each evening. They could not know that their world was changing. They could not know that future generations would study these years. And they could not fully understand the danger they faced. The plague spread through a world that lacked many of the answers we take for granted today. People saw sickness. They saw fear. They saw death. But they did not know what caused it. That uncertainty often made the suffering even greater. Rumors spread. People searched for explanations. Many found none. Yet despite that uncertainty, life continued. The roads remained. The cities endured. And Europe slowly became something new. What began as distant rumors along the trade routes of the East eventually transformed an entire continent. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Black Death. Human beings are often changed not only by what happens to them, but by what they fail to understand while it is happening. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story and found it both interesting and thought-provoking. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It is a simple way to support the channel and helps more people discover stories like these. And if you have thoughts about tonight's topic, I would love to hear them in the comments. I always enjoy reading where you are listening from and what parts of history you would like to explore next. For now, thank you for spending part of your evening here. Take care of yourselves. Get some rest. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a peaceful night. I will see you again in the next story.